Hello, my name is Mary May. I'm from Tuckahoe, New Jersey, and I've been quilting for about 50 years. And I've learned a few things along the way, and I've made a lot of mistakes along the way too. So don't think that I started out as being an expert and will just automatically become one, just because you're who you are. So I've been making quilts since about the 1970s, the late 1970s, around the bicentennial, and started to teach quilting around the end of the 1980s. So, and I've traveled all the way from Key Largo to Ottawa, Canada, teaching classes at shops and guilds and at conventions. So it's been an interesting trip, and I've learned a lot along the way. So I want to share a little bit with you today about how to make a log cabin block. It's a very basic traditional block. It looks like this. It has a single square in the center, and then it has strips that are pieced around it in a spiral direction. So for example, on this one, let's see, I started with the small dark piece down here, added this one, and then that one, and that one, and then just continued going around. And you'll notice on the block that half of the strips are light and half of the strips are dark. They can be very scrappy like this one, or they could be just three fabrics like this one in the center, a light on one side and dark on the other side. Now, traditionally, the center square is either a red or a yellow, which represents the home hearth in a traditional log cabin. Once you have your blocks made, there are many ways to lay out your blocks. So you can do them in kind of a traditional just rows and rows. This one is called sunshine and shadow, because there's kind of the shadows and there's the sunshine, but each of the blocks can be individually pointed out here. So there's one there, there's one there. Okay, so you can just see how they're turned back and forth to make a design. Okay, so you already saw that one. This one is straight furrows. Okay, and then, so this one is more scrappy, but it has two different colors, one yellow on one side and green on the other. Yellow for the light side, green for the darker side. This one is just in shades of blue. And another way to piece a log cabin block is what they call courthouse steps. In this case, what you do is you start again with your center square, and you piece a piece of fabric, like in this case darks, at the top and the bottom of it on opposite sides instead of going around in a spiral. And then you do the opposite sides here, and then you do up and down opposites and side to side opposites, and alternate that back and forth. Okay, this is a different version of it. We're scrappy. And believe it or not, this is actually a courthouse steps setup. With this one, I did a green strip, and then a dark teal strip, and then went side to side and green teal, and then teal green, and then green teal again. So that it looks like it's twisting around in a little spiral. Okay. These are a couple of different ways that there's a very limited number of ways that you can lay out courthouse steps blocks, but one of them kind of makes us columns, and the other one can kind of make almost like little pinwheels. Okay. Other types of log cabin blocks are this one, where it's called an off-center log cabin, where on one side, doesn't matter which side, one side you have narrow strips, and on the opposite side you have wider strips. So from a distance, it kind of appears to have almost a curved look to it across the center of it. Okay, so here's one layout showing that. It's kind of a little bit hard to see, but you can see how looks like it's curving. And then there's this one that's called straight furrows, but you can kind of see how it waves a little bit as it goes diagonally across. Okay, another way to make a log cabin is to do what they call a quarter log cabin block. Instead of going all the way around, you start with your center square and just do one side and then one side, and the other side. Just two adjacent sides back and forth instead of going all the way around. Okay, so these are a couple layouts with that configuration. Okay. And then you can get into the fancy stuff. So this one's a spiral log cabin. So again, it starts with that center square, but in this case, you're piecing little triangles all the way around and around and around. So it kind of looks like a little snail as it's coming out. This is one of the layouts you can do, and here's another layout that you could do. Okay, but you can see how different it looks. This one has darks in the center and then alternating with lights in the center. This one kind of makes little pinwheels in the center where they meet. And finally, there's I should not say finally, because there are other variations besides these too. This is what I call the twisted log cabin. This one uses skinnier triangles as it spirals around. And here are a couple of layouts with that block. Again, you know, sometimes you can get a secondary design in the middle, like this one makes a real pretty, almost like a flower in the middle of the pink side. Whereas this one just kind of undulates back and forth. So in our next video, we're going to show you how to piece a log cabin block, and then we'll show you some other options. And I thank you for joining us. Traditionally, the center square on a log cabin block, steps if I can find it again, is either yellow or red, which represented the home hearth, okay, like the chimney, the center of the house. Okay, so I've chosen a little patch today that has yellow in it, for my center patch, and this is a 2.5 inch square. The seams on a quilt block are 1/4 inch wide, okay, which is not very wide. So you don't have a whole lot of room for error, which means that every step of the process, you want to be as accurate as you possibly can. So you want to, you know, if it says to cut a 2.5 inch square, you cut a square that is exactly 2.5 inches square. You can use a rotary cutter or you can use scissors to cut, but it needs to be accurate. Okay, another thing that you need to know about is the difference between pressing and ironing. Okay. Because these patches have been in a scrap box, they're a little bit wrinkled. So I'm going to put one on my ironing pad and I'm going to press it. Or actually, I'm going to iron it. I'm ironing it. Okay. Before I cut it. So that way I know I'll have a nice, consistent block. Okay, this one's kind of really wrinkly. So I'm going to spray it with like a spray starch kind of thing. And ironing is going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Kind of like you're ironing a shirt. Pressing, on the other hand, is where you're pressing up and down. You're just going like that and moving the iron a little bit and pressing again. Okay, and you'll see where that's important in a few minutes when we get to that point. Okay. Okay, we have all our strips cut. The center square is 2.5 inches square. All the other strips I've cut to 2 inches wide. Okay, just for consistency. It doesn't really matter. You could use 1.5 inches wide, which will give you a 1 inch strip after it's finished, which means after the seams have been sewn on each side. Okay, so I'm going to start with my one of my darker fabrics, and I'm going to sew one to the bottom, and I'm going to sew one to the side. Okay, so I'm going to come over to the machine. Okay. And notice that I haven't cut these to the exact length yet, but that's okay. Sometimes if you're making a whole bunch of these blocks at the same time, you can do what's called chain piecing, where you're just sewing directly from one piece to the next, which saves thread and time. Okay, and you don't need to back tack at the end of each seam with this. The theory is that with quilting, each seam is going to be crossed by another seam, and that's going to lock it in. Okay, so I have the first strip sewn. Now I'm going to snip it off so it's the same width as that center square. I'm going to bring it over to my pressing mat. I'm going to press it, which is straight up and down, and then I have it with the darker side on top, so that the seam allowance, which is the distance between where I sewed and the outside edge, is called a seam allowance. So that goes towards your darker fabric. Okay, and pressing. Okay, so it's important to press after each seam. Okay, so now I'm going to, actually I think I can use the remnants of that first strip and sew that onto a side it's right next to the first strip. An adjacent size. Okay. Cut the threads. Snip it off so that it's the same length as the rest of it. Bring it over to the iron. Now normally you would be making more than one quilt block at a time. You would be making maybe a dozen or so. So you could do this a little bit more efficiently. So I'm pressing. Okay, so there's two strips on the dark sides. Now I'm going to switch to the light side and continue going around in a clockwise direction. Put this one right sides together. So with an accurate 1/4 inch seam, keeping the raw edges even along the side of the presser foot. Oops, wrong scissors. Okay, and again, snip it off. Press it back. And it's ready for the next strip. Okay, let's see, is this long enough to go there? Nope, it's not long enough, so I need to use my other strip. Okay. Make sure your edges are nice and even. Threads. Now it's important to trim off these pieces as you go along because you don't want all these extra thicknesses of layers in the middle of your quilt when you go to put it together and quilt it. Okay, so this is second light side. Okay, so here's the center of our block, and this is the traditional piecing method. I guess I didn't print out a blue one, huh? Where you start with your center block and you start going around in a spiral. Okay, so the next two strips would be dark, dark and dark, and then switch back to light and light, and we'll come back in a few minutes and show you the results of our block. Okay, so this is our completed block, and this is the first round that I demonstrated for you, and then I added 2 more rounds so that it's half dark and half light. So then it can be laid out in a number of different ways, like the straight furrows, streak of lightning, sunshine and shadow, or just in plain old rose. Okay, because it's, you know, the half light, half dark, you can kind of play around with that and make many different layouts from this. So that's it for today. Basically, remember to be accurate when you're cutting, accurate when you're sewing, when you're pressing. Make sure you press all the fabrics back so there are no pleats in here, because then that's going to change the size of your block. And you want to be very consistent with it, because if you have one block that's 11.5 inches square and another block that's 10.5 inches square, they're not going to fit together. So accuracy is very important in quilting. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you next time. Okay, so this is a log cabin quilt where each block is put together with either the light sides touching or the dark sides touching. And this particular layout is called barn raising. I don't know why, but that's what it's called. So, and this one is made kind of scrappy, so that it's a variety of different fabrics used on the light side and a variety on the dark side. But you can see that this is one of the many ways that you can lay out a log cabin quilt.